Vienna, 1946. A man sits across from a doctor in a quiet office. He has survived Auschwitz. He has lost his wife, his parents, almost everyone he knew. The war is over, but something in him hasn't fully accepted that yet. You can see it in the way he holds himself, slightly braced, as if the next blow is still coming. The doctor leans forward and asks him something unusual. Not, "What happened to you?" Not, "How are you sleeping?" He asks, "What kept you going?" The man pauses. In 2 years of captivity, through selections and starvation, and the systematic destruction of everything he was, nobody had ever asked him that. The question itself feels like an act of respect, like being handed back something that had been taken. The doctor's name is Viktor Frankl, and the patients he is writing about, their struggles, their survival, their answers to that question, would become the foundation of one of the most important psychological works of the 20th century. His central argument was simple and at the time radical. The primary human drive is not pleasure, not power, but meaning. That a person can endure almost anything if they can answer the question why. He had watched it in the camps. The men who stopped repairing their shoes, who stopped washing their faces in the cold water each morning. Frankl noticed that this was always the beginning of the end. Not physical deterioration, but the abandonment of small dignities, small acts of self-maintenance that only make sense if you believe the future is worth showing up for. The ones who survived longest were not always the strongest. They were the ones who still had something to live toward, a person waiting for them, a work left unfinished, a question they still wanted to answer. Meaning, Frankl argued, is not a luxury. It is a biological necessity. Without it, the self begins to dissolve. Frankl arrived at this through the extremity of lived experience. But the same insight had been reached before, through a different kind of extremity, 2,000 years earlier, on the other side of history. The Stoics were not a school of comfort. They were a school of precision. Epictetus was born a slave in the 1st century AD, brought to Rome with nothing, no rights, no property, no freedom of movement. And yet the people who came to hear him speak, many of them wealthy and powerful Romans, left his lectures shaken in a way they couldn't quite name. He had something they didn't. When asked how, he gave the same answer every time, not with the tone of someone who had made peace with his circumstances, but with the tone of someone who had found something inside them that circumstances couldn't touch. There are things that are up to us, he said, and things that are not. What is up to us, he said, our judgments, our desires, our responses to what happens. What is not up to us, our bodies, our reputations, our circumstances, what other people do. Most human suffering, he argued, comes from treating the second category as if it belongs to the first, from spending energy resisting what was never ours to control. This is the Stoic dichotomy of control. Stated plainly, it sounds almost too simple, until you try to live it. Marcus Aurelius spent 20 years trying. He was Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the Western world, and he wrote the Meditations entirely for himself, with no intention that anyone else would ever read them. What you find in those pages is not the polished philosophy of a master. It is the daily effort of a person who keeps forgetting what he knows and keeps having to find his way back. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He wrote this, then went back to the plague killing his people, the war on the frontier going badly, the weight of empire, then forgot. Then came back to the page and wrote it again. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. This line has a different quality from the others. It isn't consolation. It isn't promising that things will improve. or that suffering has a hidden purpose. It is saying something more demanding, that the obstacle and the path are not two separate things, that the resistance you're pushing against is itself what builds the capacity to push. Marcus was not a saint. He was a tired, frequently unwell man who believed certain things about the human mind and spent 20 years falling short of them and starting again. The Meditations are not a record of achievement, they are a record of practice. And here is where the 2,000 years collapse. Frankl, writing after the camps, arrived at a formulation that has become one of the most quoted sentences in modern psychology. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Read that next to Epictetus, next to Marcus, 2,000 years apart, a slave, an emperor, a psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz. All three pointing at the same thing, the same interior space, the same insistence that something in the human being remains, always, beyond the reach of what happens to it. This is not coincidence. What these men knew from the inside, neuroscience has spent 30 years learning to measure. When people perceive that they have agency, even partial agency, even limited choice, something in the brain shifts, cortisol drops, the amygdala's alarm quiets, the prefrontal cortex, the part of us that reasons and plans and imagines a future, comes back online. The simple act of identifying what you can influence, separating it clearly from what you cannot, moves the brain from helpless reaction into deliberate response. The Stoics thought they were practicing virtue. They were also, without knowing it, building a more resilient brain. What Epictetus understood from inside a slave's life, what Marcus kept relearning at the top of the Roman world, what Frankl discovered in the worst place human civilization has ever produced, it is the same thing. Not that suffering is good, not that you should be grateful for what breaks you, but that inside every circumstance, no matter how narrow, there is a dimension of yourself that the circumstance cannot reach. Your judgment, your attention, the direction you aim yourself in. These were never taken from you. They were only forgotten. And the moment you remember them, the moment you ask not why is this happening to me, but what remains within my control, something shifts. Not the situation. You. This is what Frankl was asking his patients in that Vienna office in 1946. Not because he had a theory to test, because he had lived the answer and needed to know whether they could find it too. Most of them could. Not easily. Not all at once. But the question, what kept you going? What still matters? What are you still moving toward? Turned out to be one that the human mind, given the chance, already knows how to answer. It has always known. Whatever you're carrying right now, what is the part of it that is genuinely yours to influence? And what have you been spending your energy fighting that was never yours to begin with? If this kind of exploration matters to you, subscribe. There is more here worth sitting with.